So this is from chapter 1, and this is, this child, Frank, was born on January 1st of 1920. And the chapters go one by one, year by year. Each chapter, I tried to make each chapter reasonably substantive and to go for 100 years. The first idea that came to me was the title, The Last 100 Years. And then everything sort of grew out of that. I knew that I wanted to set it in Iowa because I think the way that a culture feeds itself is very indicative of what that culture is. And agriculture in America has changed enormously since 1920. So I wanted to talk about that issue. I think that's an important issue that people in cities should pay attention to. And so this is Frank, and I will read a little bit of something from Frank's point of view. On the front porch, sitting up, he had just learned to sit up on a folded blanket. Frank Langdon, aged 5 months, was playing with a spoon. He was holding it in his right hand by the tarnished silver bowl, and when he brought it toward his face, his eyes would cross, which made Rosanna, his mother, laugh as she shelled peas. Now that he was sitting, he could also drop the spoon and then very carefully pick it up again. Before learning to sit, he had enjoyed lying on his back and waving the spoon in the air, but if he dropped the spoon, it was gone. This was no longer the case. One of the qualities Rosanna attributed to little Frank was persistence. If he was playing with a spoon, then it was the spoon he wanted to play with. If he dropped the spoon and she happened to give him a sock doll, the sock doll that her sister Eloise had sewn just for Frank, Frank would fuss until she gave him the spoon. Now sitting up, he put the spoon down and picked it up and put it down and picked it up. Although he much preferred the spoon to the doll, Rosanna always told Eloise and her mother how much Frank liked the doll. Eloise was now knitting him a wool hat. It was her first knitting project. She expected to have it done before October. It's now May. Rosanna reached into the basket of pea pods and took the last handful. She didn't mind shelling peas. Frank was a good baby, hardly ever fussy, which according to Rosanna's mother was a characteristic of all her side of the family. Speaking of peas, Rosanna and her sister and 4 brothers were just like peas in a pod for being good babies. And here was Frank, another of the same breed, blonde, beautiful and easy, plenty of flesh, but not a bit of fat, active, but not fussy. Went right down every night and only got up once, regular as sunrise, then down again for another 2 hours while Rosanna made breakfast for Walter and the hired man. Could she ask for a better baby? Rosanna finished shelling peas and set the bowl on the blanket, then knelt in front of Frank and said, "What a boy. What a darling boy. Are you a darling boy?" And she kissed him on the forehead because her mother had impressed upon her that you never, never kissed a baby on the lips. She laid her hand gently on the top of his head. Frank still had his grip on the spoon, but his mother's face transfixed him. As it loomed closer and then retreated, his gaze followed it. And as she smiled, he smiled, and then laughed, and then he waved his arms, which resulted in the spoons being thrown across the blanket, a first. He saw it fly and he saw it land, and his head turned slightly so he could watch it. Rosanna laughed because on his face was a bona fide look of surprise, very advanced as far as Rosanna was concerned, though she would have to admit that she had never paid one iota of attention to her brothers and sister except when they were in her way or in her charge. No one ever said that she enjoyed watching them or had a flair for it. Now Frank's body tilted forward, and all of a sudden he fell over on his side, cushioned by the blanket. Being Frank, he didn't cry. Rosanna sat him up again and handed him the spoon, then she stood up, thinking that she could hurry into the house and set the bread loaves, which should have completed their second rising by now, into the hot oven and be back out in a minute or two. Nothing could happen in a minute or two. Spoon in hand, Frank saw and heard his mother's dress swish around her legs as she went inside, and then the screen door slapped shut. After a moment, Frank returned his attention to the spoon, which he was now gripping by the handle, bowl upward. He smacked it on the blanket. And though it was bright against the darkness of the blanket, it made no noise. So he brought it again to his face, got bigger and brighter and bigger and brighter. This was the confusing part. And then he felt something, not in his hand, but on his face, a pressure and then a pain. The spoon jumped away from him, and there was noise, his own noise. His arm waved and the spoon flew again. Now the spoon was small. It didn't look like a spoon. Frank looked at it for a very long time. And then he looked around the blanket for something that was in reach. The only thing was a nice clean potato into which Mama had cut 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Frank was not terribly interested in the potato, but it was nearby, so his hand fell upon it, gripped it, and brought it to his mouth. He tasted the potato. It tasted different from the spoon. More interesting was the sudden appearance of the cat. Orange, long, and just his, Frank's size. Frank let the potato drop as he looked at the cat. And then the cat was sniffing his mouth and smoothing its whiskers across Frank's cheek, squatting to inspect the potato, pressing himself into Frank until Frank fell over again. Moments later, when the door opened and the flap closed, the cat was crouched on the porch railing, purring, and Frank was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling of the porch and kicking his legs. Left, right, left, right. Mama picked him up, then arced him through the air, and he found himself pressed into her shoulder, his ear and the side of his head warm against her neck. He saw the cat one last time as the porch spun around him, and beyond that, the green gold grass and the pale horizontal line of the dirt road and the 2 fields, one for oats, a thick undulating surface, and one for corn, a quiet grid of still squares. Oh, there's a breeze, thought Rosanna. I'll open the upstairs windows. And all around that, the different thing, empty, flat, and large, the thing that lay over all things. So that's Frank to begin with. Now, one of the things that I know from having children of my own is that each one is whoever he or she is from day one. And I quite remember when my first one was born, and I would read the baby books and I would try to follow directions. Didn't work. And I thought it was me, just not, my technique must have been wrong. And then the second one was born, and when the doctor or the nurse put her into my arms, I thought, wow, this is an entirely different baby. She even holds her body differently. And I had never seen in a book an author try to begin with that idiosyncrasy of humanity as presented by babies. And so I really wanted to do that. And it gave me a way to portray my characters, and the 5 characters in the family are Frank, who's born in 1920, Joe, who's born in 1922, Lillian, who's born in 1926, Henry, who's born in 1932, and Claire, who's born in 1939. It gave me a way of thinking about them and setting them up. And so then when they went out into the world, I would do a lot of research about what was out in the world. And then I would have an idea, because I felt I knew them even from when they were babies. I would have an idea about how they made their way in the world. And so that's how the novel shaped itself. And that was a great pleasure for me. I would say that was one of the main pleasures for me, was to have set up my characters and then see them go. And in this, so Frank is now year is this? 1933, so Frank is now 13. And it's the middle of the Depression and the drought. And so it says this is the summer of 1933. Papa and Frank mostly stayed out of the house. That was the easiest thing. Once in a while, Papa said, "Well, son, your mama cannot be pleased." And that's the way women get to be sometimes. You have to make up your mind to put up with it and go about your business. The outside work could have been worse, had been worse. At least this year there was almost enough rain and the crop looked pretty good. When the sheep shearers came, Papa gave Joey all the wool because he said that Frank had hardly done a thing for those 4-H lambs. If they had been left to him, they would have starved to death. And so what if Joey got a few bucks for his wool? Frank had stretched out his rabbit skins from the winter on the south side of the barn, and then he'd taken them to Dan Crest, who found a man from Des Moines who bought them for $1 apiece. That was $22. And said they were good quality and the ladies will love them. He said that what he was really looking for was fox, though. No one could resist fox. So one thing Frank did to stay out of the house was roam down by the creek and through the fields, scouting fox burrows and keeping his eyes peeled for other possibilities. Papa said that this was very enterprising. Of course, he did all of his other work too, feeding the cattle and Jake and Elsa, working the fields, fixing fence and planting. Pruning the Osage orange hedge had fallen to him too, and he had hated it until a new boy at school from out of state somewhere had told him you could make a good bow and even arrows from the branches of that hedge, and he spent part of the winter doing that. Papa complained about all the farm work, especially now that Elsa was almost 20 and Jake was not much younger. That's the 2 horses. A plan he'd had of raising a foal and getting another one had come to nothing. Grandpa Wilmer had gone out of the horse business. What were they going to do? Maybe Elsa would last through the year and maybe not. Papa said for the 100th time as he was putting them away and Frank was hanging up the harness. Well, we'll see what happens. Maybe Roosevelt will send us a couple of good horses now that he's been inaugurated. But Frank didn't consider himself a horseman. He considered himself a tractor man. He kept his eye peeled for tractors. There were 3. 2 on the other side of Denby, owned by the Marshalls and the Larsons, and 1 about 2 miles north of the school, owned by none other than the Dugans. The Dugans' tractor was a John Deere, green as a stalk of corn, with yellow wheels, and Frank thought it was much better looking than the Farmall. But he did agree about how the Farmall was more like a tricycle and easier to steer. Both of the tractors on the other side of Denby were Farmalls, black. Grandpa Wilmer was not going to be the one to get the first tractor in the family. He was out of the horse breeding business and had sold his stallion to a breeder down in Missouri for next to nothing. A fellow who had imported some giant donkeys from France after the war and was trying to develop a new type of hinny. But for what? Frank wanted to know. Better to have a tractor. Mama and Papa were already arguing about whether Frank should go on to the high school. It wasn't that he couldn't do the work. Everyone knew that he could and would. He liked the work. Miss Grant said that she had nothing more to teach him. He knew everything she knew already and a lot of other things she didn't, and so she had had him teach the younger boys, even though he was not allowed to smack them if they made mistakes. The high school was a ways, 3 miles, and without any help on the farm, Papa did not see how he was going to afford anything about this. If Frankie walked, it would take an hour, half an hour, thought Frankie, because he could run the whole way. And the hack was slow too, since it had to wind around to several other farms and pick up other youngsters. But how was Walter going to afford the gasoline to take him, and who would drive? The school day at the high school was a long one, especially with the going back and forth. "You're smartest child," shouted Mama. "You want to bury him on the farm for the rest of his life. You think this place is the be-all, end-all, and it isn't." Frank's solution was a bicycle. He had seen one for sale at a secondhand store in Usherton, a cruiser type, not very old, $15. He knew Papa was going to object. That was always his first response to anything, and maybe it would be hard to pedal on the dirt road sometimes, but the roadbed curved upward, and he was sure he could pedal fine. So he went straight down the middle and watched for ruts. Not to mention snow and ice. The thing was, to get to Usherton and to do that, he would have to take the car. Remember, he's 13. What you did when you wanted to get away with something was not to plan, but to look for an opportunity. Frank didn't think that bicycle was going anywhere. $15 was a lot of money with everyone out of work, and half the shops in Denby and Usherton boarded over, so he waited. A few weeks passed, and the argument went on about high school. Mama now wondered why a man who planned to have a family would buy a farm off and away from everything. And Papa asked her if she should understood the first thing about soil fertility and wells and taking what you could get. And Mama said she understood all of that perfectly well. Thank you, then burst into tears again. Papa said Frank had 8th grade left to go. Why not worry about it later? And Mama said he's teaching the younger boys. There's nothing left there for him. The opportunity came one morning after a not-so-big blow-up at the breakfast table. Joey and Lillian had fled, saying they had to be at school early, and Frank was lingering behind the barn, wondering if maybe hooky wasn't a nicer thing to do on a lovely day than sitting in that stuffy schoolhouse. Grandpa Otto drove up in his truck, and Papa wiped his hands on his overalls, ran out to the road, and got in without shouting goodbye. There had been nothing said about this at breakfast, so Frank didn't know why Papa was going to the other farm, but so be it. Frank circled the barn, then the back of the house until he could look into his own window. His room was empty and still. The door to the rest of the house closed. Frank pushed on the screen and climbed in to get his money. He did know how to drive. Papa had taught him in case of emergency. Mama had never learned. Someone had to. But he hadn't driven by himself before. Backing the car out was no problem. He just released the brake and let it slide. Once he reached the road, he started it up, backed around, and drove away without a glance. If Mama was waving at him from the porch, he would find out about it later. He sat up as straight as he could and looked carefully at every intersection for any other vehicles. But what vehicles would there be? It was a clear day. Everyone was in the fields. After maybe half an hour, he went through those woods and over the river, which had risen almost as high as the banks and into town. Now was the confusing part. How to get to the shop, which he had seen when he was in town with Papa a few weeks ago. But there were plenty of cars and trucks, and he just did what the ones with the dirty wheels did, headed toward the farm supply store. Probably it took him a little longer to get there than it would have taken Papa, but he recognized the way as he passed. As for driving, he kept to the right, used his hand signals, and maintained the same speed as everybody else, and there it was, the Back for More store. And right in the window, the bicycle. Fortunately, no one was parked in front, so all Frank had to do was pull over, glide to a stop, and turn the car off. The woman in the store was glad to sell the bicycle. She said, it's so nice when a young person has a chance to see the countryside. And this is a lovely Columbia, hardly used. She smiled at Frank's $15 bills and held the door for him as he wheeled the thing out. She said, "Is your father..." But Frank just pretended he had nothing to do with the car and got on the bicycle and rode it around the corner. It was harder than he thought it would be, but then the streets were paved, so it was a lot easier in that way. In all his planning, he'd forgotten that he'd never actually ridden a bicycle. It took about an hour, weaving and winding down the streets of Usherton, some a little busy and some nice and empty. He even waved to Pastor Elmore as he passed their church. He heard Pastor Elmore's shout following him. Back at the shop, he saw the sign in the window, closed for lunch, and he hurriedly opened the passenger door and slid the bike in front of the back seat, lifting the wheel a bit and twisting it so the thing would fit. Then he got in and drove home, which took a little longer because he was so excited that he kind of forgot how to shift and stalled out a couple of times. He did remember to buy some gas. He brought along $1 for that. He got almost 6 gallons. That's accurate, which was pretty good. he thought, and would go some way toward pleasing Papa in spite of himself. He also put some air on the tires of the bicycle. Well, they were waiting for him when he got home. Turned out that Papa was only at Grandpa Otto's for an hour or so, and Mama did remember seeing the car drive away, and Papa went over to the school to see if Frank was there. Maybe they were all sitting on the porch because it was a nice day. Maybe they were waiting to see what was going to happen. As he drove in, Papa stood up, came down the steps. He looked pretty mad, though he wasn't undoing his belt. Without glancing at him, Frank went smartly around the back of the car, opened the door, and eased the bicycle out. He heard Joey say, "Oh, boy." Papa met him in the bicycle at the edge of the grass. He snapped, "What's that?" "It's a Columbia Cruiser. I think it's about a year old, not much more." "How did you get it?" "Well, I took some of my rabbit skin money and I bought it for riding to the high school. I estimate I can get there in half an hour or less, faster than the hack." His voice was getting too quick. He glanced at Papa. "Who gave you permission to take the car?" "No one." Mama had Henry on her hip, standing on the top step of the porch, and Frank knew what to do. He smiled at her. And then she said, "You're always talking about enterprising, Walter. That's enterprising." He made his voice level and businesslike. "I can start high school in the fall and graduate when I'm 17. Then I put $1 worth of gas in the car." Walter said, "Oh, good Lord. Well, your punishment is to wash the car inside and out. Got me?" Frank knew he could get Joey to help. "Oh, thank the Lord you're back safe," said Rosanna. "My heart was in my throat." But she couldn't hide that she was pleased. One of the things I like to do is have somebody shout out a year and then read something from that year. In this case, it has to be between 1920 and 1953. But I could read from Golden Age, but in that case it would have to be between 1987 and 2019.
1951.
1951, okay. So Frank is the one, for his own reasons, who goes off to the Second World War. He's the right age, and there's a couple of reasons, I'm not going to say why, that he needs to get out of town. And when he is in the army, he's a good shooter because he's a good gunman. And so they make him a sniper, which there weren't too many snipers in the European theater, but there were a few. And so first he goes to North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, and then up through the south of France. And one of his friends is a sort of mysterious Italian-American guy from New Jersey. And so you know that the mysteriousness has to do with a few things. And so when they get back, they happen to be at Belmont Racetrack. Frank and his wife happen to be at Belmont Racetrack, and they run into this man. His name is Rubino. And Frank starts chatting with him. Now, something happens to Frank's wife that happened to me. I have to say this. I'm related on my father's side to the Upjohns. And sometime in I think it was the mid-'80s, I came into some money. And the reason I came into it was that as an Upjohn, the person who had left it, who had died in 1916, hated everyone in his family so much that he said that it could not be distributed until everyone, including all the babies, had died. Everyone then alive. And so by the mid-'80s, everyone then alive had died. So I got $25,000. So I thought this is a wonderful thing. And what I did with it was I bought a house in northern Wisconsin, summer house. So So when Frank meets Rubino's in the business of buying houses in places that are about to be torn down, and then getting the state to pay him a lot of money for those houses so they can run a highway through there. So this is 1951. Frank is now 31. The return on their Rubino investment had been $19,000 plus the original $6,000. In a single year, old Uncle Jens, that was the guy who had died, that's what they called their amount of money, the Uncle Jens Fund. Old Uncle Jens had rolled over in his grave 12 times, but that was not what Frank was thinking of when he looked at Andy and Janet and said, yeah, so if we buy me an MGTD with a little of the payoff, what can we buy you? Jim Upton had an MGTD, left-hand drive, very exotic, and not something Frank wanted, but there was nothing that he really wanted. She glanced at him and Janet and then surveyed their small kitchen. By rights, she should say a house, but she said, I saw a navy shantung skirt with its own petticoat that was 9 yards around the hem the other day. I even sat Janny in the corner of the dressing room and tried it on with the contrasting jacket. How much was it? You should. She glanced around again. I don't think it would fit inside this duplex. She reached for her pack of Luckies that was lying on the table. Nutria is always nice. It could be quite blonde with lovely highlights. A Nutria jacket with a nipped waist. Why not the skirt and the house to wear it in? Those Levittown houses are 25 feet by 32 feet now. Oh, Frank, Andy laughed. I'm not ready for a house yet. Just a very large skirt is fine. It turned out, though, that what they bought was a television so that Andy could watch the news. Dinner would be on the table when he got home. Tonight it was minute steaks and mashed potatoes, some salad, and some red cabbage, which Andy was fond of. They ate quietly, and Andy was pleased because Janet actually took a bit of the cabbage. Andy said, it's sweet underneath. Bitter is the first flavor you taste, but if you take your time, it's nice. She understands that, don't you, little Eskling? We should try her on some schnitzel. You should try us on some schnitzel. I love that. I keep forgetting to find the recipe. They moved into the living room, Frank carrying Janet and Andy carrying the last of her lemonade and her Luckies for her after-dinner smoke. And then the news came on. Frank settled Janny in his lap and picked up a magazine. Andy's preferred news show was John Cameron Swayze's Camel News Caravan. Swayze had a Circus Barker delivery style that made Frank laugh, so he didn't mind it. They found the news always to be a few days behind things, if you were keeping your eyes and ears open. The news show was only 15 minutes long, and Frank was about a page into the article. He was reading, and Janet was sitting quietly when Andy started yelling at the TV. Setting Andy off, he had once thought, was nearly impossible. Was there anyone as agreeable and accepting as Andy? They'd never had an argument, and Frank liked it that way. Mama, not slow to tell Papa what to do, had given Frank a distaste for domestic noise. So maybe, startled at Andy's tirade, he squeezed Janet a little too hard, but there she was, screaming too. Hey, barked Frank, and Andy whipped around in her chair. She said, he was right. Who was right? MacArthur was right. We should have gone into China right then and done in those Chinese communists, and Truman fired him, and now we're going to all have to pay because Stalin is going to give them the bomb. Frank didn't completely disagree with this assessment. No one did, so he only said, but that was April, and he got away with it. I thought they would impeach him, but they chickened out, and now what? She reached for the baby. Frank paused for a moment before he handed her over, but decided it was safer in the end to do it, and took her in her arms. Janet's crying subsided. Frank stroked Andy's hair. Everything was quiet for a moment. There was a Tide commercial, and the music started for You Bet Your Life. Andy turned the TV off. Janet struggled to get down, so Andy put her on the floor, and she crawled to her toy box. Andy got up and came over, sat in Frank's lap, put her head against his shoulder. She said, "I'm sorry," I snapped. "You know what? Every day I sit in this duplex and all I think about is bombs." "You do?" "I do." Andy sat up. He said, "Don't you? Every single thing we do is on the surface. Every single thing we do is just a pretense that we aren't going to be blown to bits by the Russians." "We aren't going to be blown to bits by the Russians, Andy." "Yes, we are." She said this with icy certainty. "They don't have a delivery system. They have a bomb or two, but," she scowled and said, "we don't know what they have, but they know what we have. We know what they have." Janet came crawling back and reached toward him. Frank gave her his hand and she pulled herself up. Andy did an odd thing. She picked up her skirt and ran the edge between her thumbs and forefingers back and forth, then said, "Why did we bomb Nagasaki?" "I don't know," said Frank. "Does Arthur know?" Arthur's Frank's brother-in-law who works with an unnamed agency. "He might, but he's never mentioned working on anything to do with the Manhattan Project." Frank knew Andy had read the John Hersey book about Hiroshima. It was on the bookshelf across the room. He avoided looking at it so that her gaze would not follow his. Was it showing Stalin something he needed to know? "I don't know," said Frank. Andy put her face on his shoulder again and after a while said, "You'll tell me when they can blow us up, right?" "Right." And then he said, "Honey, maybe this is an effect of listening to the news too often. It's just a show like any other show." Andy nodded. After Janet went down and they were reading, though, the argument resumed. Andy looked up from her issue of Vogue and said in a surprisingly bitter tone, "Everyone in the State Department is just busy as bees making sure the commies know all about us." His mistake was saying, "us." He had picked up the morning paper, but in fact was remembering that night in Strasbourg when they discovered that the Jerrys had vanished. "Yes, us." He turned and looked at her, alight with indignation. She was beautiful. He said, "I don't think the commies care about you and me, Arthur. Arthur and Lillian maybe, but not. What about Judy?" "Judy?" He put down the paper, but of course he knew whom she meant. "You knew her. She knows you. You work at Grumman. Don't you think she's keeping track of you?" "Well, I'd be flattered," but it was his second mistake. She leapt off the couch. "You would be flattered? Anyway, she doesn't know who I am. She never knew who I was. She thought I was Frances Burnett from Dayton, Ohio. Baby, I've covered my tracks." After making this flat joke of the thing, he reached for her hand, tried to pull her back to the couch and kiss her. Andy said, "Did you love her?" "No, Andy, I did not." She stayed over by the arm of the couch. "Did she know that?" "Know that I didn't love her? Yes, I saw her once a month. It was a very cool relationship." "Did you tell her that you loved her?" "No." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the usual things, that she was nice, that she was fun, that she was special, that she looked good tonight, that I liked her outfit, that she had changed her hairdo, had she lost some weight, had she been to the dentist, had she, I don't know. I never said I. I always said you. That's the way you treated me in college." "Is it? But I told you I loved you. Once. More than once." But Frank felt his heart start to beat more quickly, the way he always did when they approached the memory of Eunice. He said, "Anyway, I was a jerk in college. We've all agreed on that. You, Andy, are the person I love. You are my wife." How Frankie felt about Hildy 9 years ago has nothing. Hildy was Andy's name that she formerly used. Has nothing to do with how I feel about you now. Nothing. She stared at him and he held her gaze. Inch by inch she eased toward him on the couch and then they kissed and he led her to the bedroom. There he helped her unbutton her shirtwaist dress, then take off the pearls and the girdle and the bra and the hose and the panties. He helped her slip her silk nightgown over her head, and then he kissed her goodnight. When she was breathing steadily and deeply, he turned out the lights and regarded the moon through the window to the right of the bed. A half moon, a good moon for hunting rabbits. No, I didn't expect to read that section. Thank you for suggesting.
Is there anything specific that you find admirable or non-admirable about people from the Midwest Iowa, for example, as opposed to people from other parts of the country?
Well, the thing I think about Iowa, people from Iowa, and I grew up in St. Louis, and so the thing I know about the Midwest is that each state is quite different. So I grew up in Missouri. I had relatives in Chicago. At one point I had a house in northern Wisconsin. I lived for a long time in Iowa. I wrote a book about Kansas. And so each state is quite different and unique. And the thing about Iowa is that it's more interesting than people give it credit for being, the landscape and the people. And the people tend to be, my experience, they tend to be thoughtful and willing to engage in ideas. But the thing that interested me in terms of this book was not the Iowans themselves, but the function that Iowa performs in our food culture and also in our national culture. And the history of Iowa is pretty interesting. And so Frank's mother, Rosanna, comes from the line of Germans that came over from Germany, and Frank's father comes from a line of English people that came over from England, and they live in the same small town. And when they get married, Rosanna's family is Catholic, and Walter's family is Presbyterian. And when they get married, that's in some ways like crossing a line that hasn't been crossed before, and that interested me. It's, it's a good place.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I read in preparation for this evening that you told an interview a few years ago that you, in the third novel, that you had you predict the outcome of the presidential election or something like that. Can you tell us about that?
No. You have to read your way to that.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
so it's another reason to buy the book.
I did, however, when I was going, touring the volume 1, I used to ask audiences who their most nightmarish candidate was. And they didn't come up with the particular nightmare that we have to come up with. I'm sorry to say. Anybody else? Yeah?
I live in California. How different is that? And have you
Well,
written
I was-
second time?
I have written, yes, my last book called Private Life, which is in French, is called, I think it's called Une vie à part. That is set in the San Francisco Bay Area, up north of San Francisco, and I have set some of the horse racing books in California, and then I also have a children's or a young adult horse series that's set in California. How different is California? Well, I live in like paradise on earth, which is Carmel Valley, California. And it has a beautiful, very steep landscape. It's a little bit green. It's a little bit greener than some of the other parts. And it's very friendly and horsey, and I like it there. But California is like a lot of big city or big states. It isn't just one thing. It's quite different from one region to the other in terms of culture. And Monterey and Carmel and the place where I live, it's like 5 tiny, quite different little towns stuck together right by the Monterey Bay. So it's quite beautiful and I love it. Yes,
Was writing 3 volumes that span over 100 years?
only 100 years exactly. 100 years exactly. Sorry.
100 years.
Yes, from January 1st, 1920 to December 31st, 2019.
Right.
Because that's how I am. I'm a picky about numbers.
Right. Well, my question is, was it as ambitious as it sounds?
Well, it led me on. So when I set up the children, so Rosanna and Walter at the beginning are 20 and 25. And then I set up the children one by one. And I read the history and I decided what each person might likely do. And so once I was doing that, then it was a matter of just keeping up with them as they go out into the world. So it seemed more ambitious before I started, but once they were going, it just led me on. It seemed natural in a way. It came to be, I came to like them quite a bit. And it came to be sort of like being on a bus with this big rowdy family and overhearing what they had to say. So I like that part. Yeah.
You seem to like the research as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sort of like set time you give yourself to do that, or do you just research until you feel like you've got a sense of what you're looking for and then you go?
It really varied from one part of the book to the other. So in general, I would think that I knew something. I would write a certain number of words. If I came to a place where I didn't know what I was talking about, I would go do more. So sometimes my daily amount of words would take a couple of hours. Sometimes it would take 4 or 5 hours as I look things up. There were a lot of research, good research things. For example, I taught for years at Iowa State, and Iowa State has a very interesting website that tells you the weather in Iowa, county by county, every day since 1900. There were some good model farm research sites where farmers did tapes and videos about what their lives had been like at various periods, and that was very helpful. And then for the Second World War, since I wanted Frank to do a thing that wasn't as frequently shown in books as, say, coming through Calais, I mean not Calais, but Normandy. There were books about that, mostly by journalists, and some memoirs too. So there was plenty of stuff out there, I just had to find it. So there was one over here, yes?
I just read your book, Private Lives, and I actually finished high school in Vallejo, California.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, that's right. So I enjoyed that book. It was great, thank you. And so I was just wondering the characters that are in it, the Lavinia and her daughter who actually lives on Muir Island, with the commander husband. Are those based on people? Or?
Absolutely. Yes. The male character, his name is Early. His last name is Early.
Oh yeah, Henry?
No, the crackpot.
Yeah, Early, yeah.
He was based on someone, the woman is based on one of my grandfather's older sisters.
Okay.
Who
Because
married.
There was a whole story about her, that was kind of the denouement at the end where she finally remembers the hanging of her brother.
That's wrong. That's not wrong, but that was fiction.
Okay, it's not.
But the crackpot was a brother-in-law of my grandfather, whose name was Thomas Jefferson Jackson C., who started out in Missouri and was considered a genius, but he spent his entire life saying that Einstein was an idiot. And so when I said I wanted to write about him, the family just remembered just, they'd say, oh, Tom C, and roll their eyes, But when I have a friend in Carmel who's a physicist, and I said, I want to write about the sky. He said, don't resurrect him, don't resurrect him. But I did it anyway.